Good morning, good afternoon for all of you that are tuned in to this edition of Transatlantic Tuesday. My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and I'm based in the German Marshall Fund's Berlin office. Thank you for joining us for the last Transatlantic Tuesday of 2022. As some of you know, Transatlantic Tuesdays is a monthly event series devoted to discussing pertinent issues in the transatlantic relationship. And I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for making this series possible. Today, we're going to be discussing the current European energy crisis and its economic consequences. It's happening right now. I believe there is a meeting in Brussels today to discuss potential cap on gas prices. And with regard to this Transatlantic Tuesday, it's, the same as always. We're going to start out with a moderator conversation for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from all of you. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the questions will queue up. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Kristine Berzina, for agreeing to moderate today's discussion. She's based at our headquarters in DC and is Managing Director for Geostrategy North. Kristine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sudha, for having me and our excellent lineup of speakers on today for this conversation. So, of course, those joining from Europe are in the middle of a cold winter snap. The US still isn't there yet. But when you look at Europe, there are many questions about what are the effects of the energy crisis on households, on individuals, on industry. And is 2020 the low point in terms of cold and expense, or is the future also unclear? We have three speakers for you today. We have Georg Zachmann. Georg is a senior fellow with Bruegel, joining us today from Berlin. So Georg, please join. We have Lisa Fischer. Lisa is a program leader on on climate neutral energy at E3G, joining us from London. And we have Oliver Ruhnau, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Sustainability at the Hertie School in Berlin. So we have various European perspectives. We'll start with a few questions. Georg, I'm going to go to you first because so much of the concern this year has been about natural gas. Is there enough natural gas? Will there be? How is it affecting households? Were we right to worry about natural gas? What is this winter looking like?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great to be between the US and Europe at the moment. I've just looked a bit into the US natural gas statistics, and it's fascinating. You barely feel the European troubles at the moment. That's really impressive how decoupled the two worlds are while they are still so linked. Now, you have been asking whether we are right to focus on natural gas. Well, actually, we should also focus quite a bit on electricity in Europe. I mean, we have the biggest electricity crisis in Europe on top of the biggest natural gas crisis in Europe. So we are really hit with a double hammer at the moment. In terms of electricity, we have been lacking about 80 terawatt hours or so of electricity from French nuclear power plants. The hydro season has been very weak. If you count that, and it's almost the same amount of electricity that has been lacking in France than the amount of gas that would be needed to produce this electricity that is lacking currently in Germany from Russia. So really two crises at once. Will we be able to get through this winter? Yes, I think storages are pretty full. What we were unsure until probably October was how much households will save in terms of natural gas, and that's looking much better than most people expected. So we have a little data track on our website. So we are currently at about 25% gas savings for the month of November compared to last year. If we carry that through, we should be good to get out of the winter with decent storage levels that bring us in a good situation to also sustain through 2023.
So through 2023, is that how far through 2023 are we talking? Because yesterday when we had Ursula von der Leyen and Fatih Birol gave a press conference in Brussels, 2023, when does how long are we good for?
There's two main uncertainties at the moment. One uncertainty is global LNG markets. So how tight will global LNG markets be? On the one hand, we should see a bit of an increase in production, and we might also hope that some countries that this year imported LNG kind of found also other ways of procuring energy. So yeah, switch to coal. On the other hand, there is the big question around Chinese LNG demand, where we don't know. The opening has just started last week, and we don't know what it will give in terms of energy consumption in China. If China consumes as much as they did in the past years, then that might easily take away some 30-40 billion cubic meters from global LNG markets, which is volumes that Europe would urgently need. Then there's a question of weather. I mean, we never know how cold this winter is going to be, and everywhere especially in the northern hemisphere. I think the good news is that it's typically not cold in all parts of the northern hemisphere. So there's always one part where it's a bit warmer. So we hope that this risk can be balanced, but let's see. And then, I mean, the question on the European side is how much can we sustain the energy savings? So can we essentially, I mean, logically, economists would assume that elasticities over time go bigger, so that people kind of now start to invest in alternative energy production methodologies, invest more in energy efficiency, and over time this is cumulative, so we essentially wean ourselves off natural gas. On the other hand, a lot of the demand reduction that we currently see is still short-term. So it's kind of people only heating a few rooms or kind of putting a pullover under their jacket. And not sure if prices normalize somewhat, whether people will still continue to do that. So it's going to be a delicate balance. My take would be slightly more optimistic than the IEA's, but I understand very well that we need to be super careful not to get too much ahead of ourselves and lay back. I think the big thing for 2023 is getting kind of the substantial things done. So investing in energy efficiency and renewables.
Thank you. On this electricity piece, Oliver, if I turn to you, you've done a lot looking at electricity in particular, and also heat pumps, other questions. How is the electricity sector looking? What are we doing that is right or wrong on the electricity side?
Yeah, maybe. So firstly, thanks for inviting me. And I can totally agree with what Georg already said, that it's a very tight situation in the electricity sector. But maybe to add one point, also comparing to the US, where we had this Texas electricity crisis, we have done some things right here in Europe, and that's interconnection between, like really tight interconnection between countries. It's only because of that we haven't seen blackouts so far in France, for example. And then the second point, maybe now turning towards electrification, there I would say that we now see really a huge ramp up of heat pumps, especially in Germany. I think in UK it's quite similar, but maybe you can add on this, Lisa. So in Germany, I've looked up the numbers. It's plus 50% this year, and it's going to, or it's expected, or the plan is to grow this by another 100% over the next 2 years. And that's supported by government, but it's really also people's decision. I mean, now if you want to buy a heat pump, it's sold out. It's really hard to get, and it's really people now wanting to buy it, installers now looking into this technology, which they haven't done so much before. And I think now it's really on people's mind to change their decision, installing more heat pumps. And that's really part of going through the prices. Of course, we need renewables to fuel the heat pumps to provide the electricity. But even if that's not going as fast as we would like to, a heat pump can save natural gas because it's so efficient. Even if we need during some hours natural gas plants to provide the electricity, a heat pump is still the better option.
Yes, and on this in particular with the renewable pairing, there are times when electricity is needed when in Berlin it is gray. it is still, it is wet and damp and unpleasant. That is maybe when you want to crank up the heat the most. Is the heat pump the right technology there on a household level still? Is it able to deal with the dense, damp stillness of your region in particular?
Yes, it is, if it's used right. I mean, the heat pumps are so efficient, as I said, that even if during some times we will need a natural gas-fired power plant, or in the future some hydrogen-fired power plants to provide electricity, even then the heat pump is the better technology. But I mean, that's about providing the energy and being energy efficient with what we have right now, but also in the future, even more renewable system. But the second point is really about the timing and also about the grid. And that's something, I think that's the challenge ahead. Now, if we double heat pump installations, we will see this in the electricity grid. And then it really depends on how these heat pumps are operated. Are they all ramping up in the morning when the peak is already high, or can we find some smart operations? So, I mean, it's about pricing, it's about flexibility aggregators to steer the heat pumps, about some smart homes to really flatten that peak and make better use of the heat pumps when the grid allows for, when renewables are available to provide the electricity.
Lisa, you have been nodding along with the matching of the grid piece. Your mandate is really to look specifically at the climate neutrality here. And Georg, in his comments, said the C word, coal, when looking at the question of energy provision and thinking about climate and the geopolitical realities of not having and not wanting Russian gas right now. Coal becomes a bigger part of the picture. When you look at what is happening this winter and how to do this transition, but make sure that people are able to pay their bills and are able to be warm, is this happening reasonably okay for the climate? Are we missing something? What is the climate picture in the context of these big challenges?
Yeah, thanks. And also I'm super glad to be here and have that transatlantic lens on the climate and energy conversation. So yeah, it is true that we've seen some coal coming back into the picture. But I think it's worth emphasizing that nowhere so far it looks like this is a structural change in policies or plans. And in fact, actually what we've been seeing is that reducing energy waste, managing down energy use, and in particular fossil fuel use is more increasingly aligned, and these are all climate measures, but increasingly aligned also with sort of goals around energy security, and in particular actually also economic security in Europe. In fact, I've recently seen data interviewing companies across Europe, all of a large share of them having said, we found ways of reducing energy waste without dialing down our production. So there was actually still untapped potential that is being tapped into now. And I feel like actually the energy security, economic security and climate conversation are merging. We've seen that also in EU statements on 2030 plans. The EU did a crisis response plan in May, the Repower EU plan, and actually the measures in there would lead to a 50% reduction in gas demands to 2030. So more than replacing what we've been importing from Russia. So that's pretty ambitious. And at the moment, they are in Brussels negotiating also legislation that would at least translate some part of that into a trajectory to 2030. Now, where I think there are still some gaps is indeed securing that we do not structurally return to coal. I don't think anyone is attending to right now, but we do need to put that into clear signals also towards the rest of the world. But the really important thing in there is the EU has done two things right now. It's focused on 2030 and it's focused on this winter. And as Georg said, this winter prices are high, but in terms of sort of supply security, we are pretty okay. We need to now stop planning winter by winter. I think we do know no matter how much drilling the US will do, we won't see sort of a large relaxation in the market before 2026, the earliest. So we really need to work out how can we get every inch of insulation, every solar panel out in this time horizon and get those cumulative savings that that Georg has talked about. And I think this is where the EU needs to do a bit better planning. I think some of the bottlenecks are not energy policy bottlenecks, but they're bottlenecks like, have we got enough electricians on the ground, right? Have we got the people who can sign off those solar panels? Have we got a smart enough grid that can receive those solar panels and heat pumps? And this is, I think, where the focus now needs to shift. Now that we know we're okay for this winter, we've got 9 months until the next winter. So we need to make best use of that. And the other really big thing for me is avoid panic buying. We all know this from going shopping before we need something. We shouldn't be panic buying more LNG than needed. We've done a study with partners in Germany. We do know if we lock in high LNG prices for too long in Europe now, this will cost us much more than actually turning every euro we have into a productive investment, into energy saving that actually makes our economy more competitive. So getting the balance right here between obviously satisfying some of the very short-term needs, but not actually locking ourselves into long-term contracts, infrastructure that we don't need and that will actually then make bills higher for longer than necessary. I think this is where Europe at the moment is sort of trying to calibrate and struggle and sort of needs to pivot from panic to actually really having a long-term plan.
Thank you. Georg, drawing on Lisa, so this winter is okay, and the need for energy efficiency and savings and big picture grid development costs, that's all important. But you talked about China and the unpredictability of the Chinese factor. How does that interplay with what Lisa was saying about not overpaying for LNG? Because compared to Chinese demand right now, there's one price, but how, is that question different in the future? How exactly does China factor into this?
Yeah, I would like to take a step back and try at the end to answer your question. But I think there's one element that we didn't talk much about so far, and I think it's very important for a US audience to understand about the situation in Europe at the moment. So in terms of volumes, we will be somehow able to manage, but there is a huge underlying crisis in terms of prices. The problem is that currently several member states spend 8% of their GDP for energy subsidies, additional energy subsidies to what they are usually doing to keep their consumers happy, because the prices increased by a factor of 10. So US prices, Henry Hub, increased by 25%. European prices sometimes increased by 1,000%. That is a huge problem for not only the industry, but also for households, for social peace, and for the unity of the European Union. There is a risk that the internal market might break over this massive strain that we are putting on it, that the Italians are saying, guys, we cannot do it any longer. We close the borders, we do with the energy we have, but we have to bring down prices. But if we bring down prices domestically, the gas would flow to Germany or elsewhere, so we have to close the borders. The breaking up of the internal market would be a massive blow to Europe. Really, I think a disproportionate blow. It sounds like an economic thing, but I think it will go much deeper than pure economics. The alternative scenario is that the Italians say, okay, guys, then we make a deal with Russia. Russia has not yet Europe has not yet sanctioned Russian gas imports. So if Russia decided to send to the new Italian government some 20 billion cubic meters or 10 billion cubic meters at a good price, it will be extremely tempting for the Italians to take that, and obviously they will have to deliver something for that, which will be very, very dangerous for Europe's unity in face of the war in Ukraine. So we are in a very, very troublesome situation over this price question at the moment. Now, the challenge is that a lot of the solutions we can bring up for prices that are based on putting in caps or things like that will just kind of fend off supply. So we will get less supply and demand will increase. So we will immediately jump into the volume problem, so that it's not going to be a solution to just play with these price caps that are again today discussed in the council in Brussels. So the only true solution is increase supplies or reduce demand, and potentially then to find socialization mechanisms inside Europe to help those countries that are in most dire need for funding. Currently, you might argue, if you want to be a bit nasty, to say, okay, Germany is actually exporting high gas prices to the rest of Europe because they kind of didn't pay attention on security of supply in the past, and France is exporting high electricity prices. And so those countries need to provide relief to the others to a certain degree. And there are tools to do that. I mean, we have this tool of joint purchasing, where money can be pulled together, and Germany might be able to give a bit more on that. We have instruments like buying out gas demand, which is essentially an alternative to resolving demand reductions through high prices by just giving people to reduce their gas demand. The problem with all those things is if you do them nationally, they are not working because the lower prices are essentially dissipating in the European market, and you domestically don't have enough of that. You need European solutions to that. And where I want to end is that here, outside countries, Norway, the US, other big suppliers can play a significant role in helping to catalyze such schemes of European unity, because I mean, there's a war in Europe, and we need to understand that we need all to stand together in that, because if some of the weak links break out over this war, it will have geopolitical consequences.
So Georg, on that, what should the US energy industry do so they can help catalyze unity? How? What is their three-step plan for them?
I think Lisa will not like to hear that, but I think the US can produce more gas. I mean, they have increased production this year by 8%, while there is a huge crisis. So I think there is something to gain for the US by exporting more energy-intensive products to Europe. I don't understand why Europe is so obsessed about CBAM at the moment. We have a problem of energy consumption in Europe, and actually letting some of this industry go to other places might make sense in the next few years. It would make sense to find ways to essentially target particular cargoes, maybe to some countries, to essentially catalyze European unity. We had a piece in the New York Times at the beginning, I think in March, where we made that case. So I think there needs to be a bit more thinking in Washington on how to help to catalyze European solidarity between the countries, because I think that is more than zero sum. It's really positive sum. So helping them to stick together by providing a bit of oil to the system. So that's the more general thinking. And on the specifics, I think we have to do a bit more deeper thinking together what is feasible, because I understand that the US is not. I mean, the US energy industry is not a state-driven industry. It's an industry that wants to make money. But the state, of course, has a role to play in setting the rules of the game, and finding ways to do that together is, I think, very helpful. And for the Norwegians, it's even clearer that they can contribute here because they have a state-driven industry.
Georg, yeah, let's keep the China question aside. And Lisa, do you want to respond quickly to Georg's push about the US role and industry?
Yeah, I think obviously the US has a role to play in the short term on additional supplies. I think I would question whether there's a need for a lot of expansion upstream. I think that is often sort of blurred in the debate. I think the IEA numbers are quite clear that if you look at capturing methane from venting and flaring, both in the US, but also among other partners, in particular Algeria, you can actually get a very long way. So that then also means you don't need lots of new infrastructure. You do not need long-term contracts. These are relatively small investments. And I think, again, this is about balancing the short term with the medium term, and that piece Georg mentioned around solidarity and in the European Union. If we price in the cost of long-term LNG supply at relatively high cost to the EU and slow down efforts on the energy efficiency and clean energy side, we will not come out with a stronger Europe. We will come out with a Europe that has more cost baked into the system than it needs to. And I do not think this is in the European interest. Whereas actually, sorry, in the US interest. Whereas actually, I do see the US has made this move now with the Inflation Reduction Act to really expand its industries, its clean energy industries. Europe is a massive market for this as well. Europe will obviously try and sort of match this. We can either go down a route where we sort of compete on those markets or we cooperate. But this is where the growth is. So being stuck in sort of conversations around those old markets, I don't think is doing anyone a favor. There is obviously things that need to be done, but I think it doesn't warrant loading loads of costs onto the taxpayer or in some cases consumers in terms of new energy new gas infrastructure in particular and long-term contracts.
There's a word we keep talking about, which is industry. And we, in the beginning, and Georg was talking about price increases, the role of the household, the individual. But there's a very big question here that we've been dancing around, which is what happens to European industry? And Oliver, if I can turn back to you, how are you seeing from Germany currently the question of industry, the future, the competitiveness? There are various questions we can bring up, the IRA and the US problem, but how does industry fit into this question right now?
Mm-hmm. So I think again that question may be answered from a more short-term and long-term perspective. And in the short term, we have seen in Germany, but I think in many other European countries, that industry is dealing quite well with the increased prices, finding some solutions, as Lisa mentioned, to improve energy efficiency, but then also some solutions to import energy-intensive products, like intermediate products like ammonia from the US. So I think it's not always about natural gas, but it's also about these products, which then help keep downstream industries running. So yes, I mean, we have lost some energy-intensive production in Europe, but that's what we need really to physically cope with the crisis. But still, we have done economically quite well. Now, looking into the future, I think there's a huge uncertainty because yes, now we're securing some LNG volumes, but that's certainly not the basis to invest into like decades-long industrial assets. But here really the discussion is around hydrogen, and can we supply this to Europe or hydrogen-based products? Can we produce this domestically? I think there Germany is like maybe not the best place, but there are some countries in Europe like Spain or Scandinavia where there are much better renewable potentials. But that's still not resolved the question. So there I see the debate and the uncertainty about, can we get this running? And then again, turning back to the industry question, but then in like clean energy industries and providing all this technology that we need for heat pumps, for hydrogen, for renewables. I think there are some issues of scaling this up. There are some supply chain issues already now with renewables. Some large dependency on China, which is very critically discussed. And I think here that's something where Europe, of course, has to improve and also seize a chance. Also in Germany, that's debated, for example, with the heat pump industry to scale this up, but also in cooperation with the US.
Thank you. We have a question coming in from a participant, from Thomas Fröhlich. Thomas asks, are there any changes to EU energy market design that you would see fit to significantly speed up the rollout of renewables and sustainably reduce energy prices? So what is the big market design piece of what we're talking about? There you see.
So the main market design element that we are currently discussing is electricity market redesign, and the challenge here is that Europe has built up over 2-3 decades relatively well-functioning short-term market. So to make sure that when the wind blows in Germany, the gas-fired plants in the Netherlands are switched off, and that's functioning really well. The big question is whether this market design encourages enough investments, and that is still up for debate. The problem that I'm seeing is that the discussion on market design in Brussels is more triggered by the question of, is the electricity price too high? So the current discussion is, can we change the market design to bring down prices quickly because they are politically unsustainable? But that's typically a bad idea. I mean, if you start with changing your market design because of a short-term shock to bring down prices, the question is whether that is really leading to a stable investment framework that helps you to get sustainably out of the crisis. So there are many people in Brussels that are kind of trying to slow down this process and splitting the process in one longer-term market design discussion for investment and one short-term fixes for the distributional effects of the crisis on the electricity market. The problem is the genie is out of the bottle. I mean, we are now discussing market design, and obviously this is increasing uncertainty for investors. So if you're an investor, you think about your future cash flows, and you don't know what the market design is going to be in 1, 2, 3, 4 years, let alone in 15 years. So I'm slightly worried that this discussion is actually pulling us back and is reducing the amounts of green investments that we would need. And I mean, it would be interesting to hear also from the other speakers what they think, but my take would be maybe we need some emergency measures to say, okay, for the next 2 years investments, we give some emergency credits for investors so that they can be sure that they make decent money out of those investments, because every installation that goes online next year gets 3.5 times more for a kilowatt hour of electricity it produces than in 2026. I mean, it's the energy we need in the next 2 years. We don't need it or hopefully don't need it as urgently in 2027.
Lisa, you want to jump in, and please do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Georg is right to mention investment certainty, although it's also important to be clear that markets are only one part of the signal of investment certainty, and there's all sorts of other regulation that actually matters. And we had a big discussion around windfall profits as well in the EU that obviously also plays into that signaling. I think in terms of what market design can helpfully do now to affect prices, I think we are seeing record numbers of heat pumps coming online, obviously also electric vehicles, solar panels, all largely on the distribution grids. I think making sure our grids are ready to absorb this and turn this into value for the grids, and making sure that this is a demand side potential that can be leveraged and that can be used to stabilize the market and reduce the numbers of hours where we need actually gas as a balance to the market. This is really the key question here. The EU has done several bits of market updates over the past 5 years already, where it tried to advance on digitizing the grid, etc. But we're not there yet. And I think if there's one thing to focus on for the market design now, it is that, because we're not ready otherwise to receive those record amounts of heat pumps and EVs and so on, and solar panels, and not ready to turn them into value for the grid and into making actually this transition cheaper for everyone. So I think that's the one thing to focus on. I think there's a lot for the EU to also learn from the US example. I think what we see a lot still in the European Union is that a lot of the grid design questions are left to the incumbents, who are not necessarily incentivized to exploit demand side potential. I think the US has much more innovation around independent system operators and planning, where the European Union can definitely learn from how things are working in the United States. And I'm hoping that some of those elements can be brought into the market design question and debate now in the European Union. Otherwise, I don't know how familiar the audience is with the European cycles, but we will have some elections in 2024. That means otherwise there won't be any change, any significant changes until after that. And usually the European processes take quite long. So if we think about what we need to get ready for over the next few years, in terms of those loads coming onto the grids, I would say this is the unleashing that demand side and digital potential is really the key priority, and that will have impacts on the prices. And in particular, actually, the market design is very much about the distribution of prices and who kind of gets to reap the benefits of renewables. And I think there we can make a difference.
Thank you. We're seeing the tug between the question of predictability for investors, understanding the ground rules, and also the room for growth and transformation. How do we balance those two very important elements? Oliver, do you want to jump in on the market design or electricity future question?
I think in some sense, we can learn a lot also from the crisis and from what's happening right now. And the crisis can also learn from all the climate debate we have seen before, because now prices are high and they signal that energy is scarce, especially when renewables aren't producing as much. And that's what we will see and need to see in the future system. And then that has been around quite a while in the climate debate, that fossil fuels must become more expensive, but then through a carbon price, but then we can redistribute that money in terms of lump sum payments to the population. And that's something we partly see in crisis intervention. So yes, now it's taking away windfall profits, and it's not the primary carbon tax, but the question is, what are we doing with the prices? Are we keeping high prices and giving money to the population as a lump sum or as a fixed fee reduction on their bill to keep energy saving incentives and incentives to switch to more efficient heating and so on intact? And we see this partly, and also see that this is working partly as far as we can tell right now, some months into the crisis. But that's something certainly to be further thought through and implemented and investigated as the crisis evolved. And maybe relating to what Lisa said on flexibility in the grid, that's something I hear a lot, but I haven't seen like proper analysis on this from Scandinavia, where they have so many smart meters and they have this variable tariffs, like time varying over time, these tariffs available. And now with prices fluctuating more and more people are switching to these variable prices. And that's quite counterintuitive. Before there was so much discussion, people don't like that volatility, but now they feel like, oh no, they understand why prices are varying. They think they can respond to that, and they opt for these tariffs. And I think that's it's very interesting, and certainly something also to investigate more and learn more from for the future.
Yes, the individual and the household, not simply as a passive factor here, but the active role that they can also play. There are a few technological things that could be changing in the future, and nuclear is a very complicated conversation in Germany, but the changes in the nuclear technologies that could happen just beyond where we are today, and potentially in the future with announcements about an entirely different kind of technology coming down the pike, begs the question, what is the role for nuclear in Germany? What is the role for nuclear across Europe? And this is a very transatlantic question, of course, because when we look at the small modular nuclear, that there's a big role for the US specifically in developing and marketing this technology, taking the place perhaps of Russia's role on the continent as a nuclear energy partner and provider. And then there's the question of fusion, which is, the first announcements today, and then we'll see what that world holds in the further future. But how do any of you see this nuclear question, and does it need to be as toxic as it has been? Georg,
I would not see kind of this debate being very productive at the in the short term. I mean, yes, we should work on nuclear fusion. Makes sense to look into that. It's scientifically extremely exciting what's going on there. And yeah, somebody wrote on Twitter today, and I found it quite interesting, that maybe in 2070, when we want to draw a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, having a nice point source for electricity is exactly what we will need. So let's work on that. But I mean, should not get ahead of ourselves. Even small modular reactors are not going to solve the Russian gas crisis. I mean, if you had some, the Poles would have happily bought some, but there are none. I mean, it will take a few more years to be deployed. I found it quite interesting what Kerry said on Ukraine, that the US is willing to help the Ukrainians with this help kind of make a business out of installing small modular reactors in Ukraine to help their energy transition and to make them independent from Russian energy. It's a fascinating new geopolitical world. I think it's also something for the Europeans to watch, because I don't think that nuclear fuel cycles are completely open. So it might well be that this creates new bonds between countries, which is potentially to be applauded. But I mean, we are living in a complex geopolitical world, so of course there might be different views from different partners about those bonds that are created through those fuel cycles. I am maybe kind of going a bit away from the technology side. What I think will potentially come out of the crisis, what is very interesting to observe, and it's still unclear. I mean, it's always the most interesting things. The unclear things is what new responsibilities will land in Brussels. So will the crisis, essentially, like so many crises before, lead to more federalization in a certain degree of the European Union, or will that not happen? It will also depend on how good we pull through the crisis. And one other element that I find very exciting, because I have worked a long time in Ukraine, is also what will the addition of the Ukrainian energy system to Europe, will that be neutral, or will it be a big contribution, or will it be a big draw? And I would like to think of it as a huge contribution to Europe. Ukraine is so complementary in so many things, that in terms of space and in terms of agricultural, bioenergy potential, hydro potential, solar, wind potential, I mean, you can start dreaming about what a free and sovereign Ukraine inside the European Union can mean for the European Union. And I would find it exciting to think more structured about how to make most out of that for both sides.
Yeah, I appreciate that optimism, and I think that especially given the perspective for greater Ukrainian integration, it's wonderful to think about Ukraine as a net contributor in so much when you look at resilience and creativity and desire for transformation. There's a lot to be drawn from, and that's a fabulous area. The counter side is that there's this fear. Is Russian gas going to just be back? Is this a pause? The pipeline issue, is an issue, but is this simply a lull? And should there be an expectation that Russian gas volumes will return to something similar to what it used to be?
It's a super pertinent question. We need to deal with that now. I mean, it's kind of for the next 3 months to be dealt with. We need sanctions on Russian gas imports, because otherwise I described this Italian scenario, and I mean, you can replace Italian by maybe even German, whatever. I mean, this risk is there that they start opening the taps. We have not sanctioned them. Those countries that get the gas are happy, and we have no tool to deal with that. It's completely crazy. I mean, we have sanctions on oil, we have sanctions on coal, and here on gas, where they have been blackmailing us all the way, we don't have a European tool. Now, currently, we get so little from them that their potential to put pressure on us is limited. it's now the moment to introduce some sort of mechanism to deal with Russian gas. I think the more credible mechanism is not to say zero, but is to say, this is the rules of the game. This is, you have to dump this gas at the TTF. You have to use this and this pipelines. You're allowed to sell between 25 and 50 BCM, not less, not more. Otherwise, you're out of business. And that's we are setting now the rules of the game of dealing with that. Take it or leave it. So that would be my plea to push also all European governments to move ahead with that, because this time window will relatively quickly close. As soon as the Russians start delivering to individual countries, it will become much more difficult to stop it again. I mean, now is the time.
And your sense of the political wins, is it feasible?
I would hope. I mean, we can always talk about bigger bargains, and I mean, at the beginning, I mentioned that there's something that the US can give, but here's something that the US can also demand from the Europeans. So maybe there's a way to combine those things.
Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. So I totally agree with Georg that this would be like the way to go forward. But I would also like to stress that I think there's no way back to before the crisis. So the uncertainty will always remain, even if Russia is starting to deliver. Now we know it's not sure, and that's something. I mean, if we look back critically, we were really naive on that, and that's nothing to be gone back to. For industry, I think new investments relying on natural gas, they will factor that in. And also for private homeowners, when they were trying to install a heat pump some years ago, it was really hard to find people that were able to do this. But now they are able to do this. And also people know that natural gas isn't something to rely on in the future. So I think, yes, I agree with Georg. There is this risk of Russia starting to deliver again, but I also think there are some structural breaks that have happened, and some trends being started that we cannot stop entirely, or Russia could not stop entirely. Still, we should try to avoid that as much as possible.
Yes.
Yeah, just to add, I think that is definitely a scenario we do need to prepare for. I also see, though, that, I mean, what I expect governments to do is really rewire the way they think about energy security, and what Oliver mentioned, that the demand side of the picture will be much more part and parcel of the evaluation process, including the supply chains. And we've already seen a big shift in attention towards critical raw materials, etc. But that this sort of merely, looking at fossil fuel supply sources is no longer that the way that governments will look at energy security, that they will try and understand also the broader political context of those countries where they're sourcing the fossil fuels, or be it the critical raw materials, but that they generally will want to reduce their dependence on that. And so I think we will see a structural break here. One other development, we focused on the EU, but I do think it's really important to also mention that this crisis has a massive global impact in terms of energy and economics. We have seen obviously prices and gas prices go up everywhere, and where in the past we had that expectation that if the European Union moves away from gas it's driven by its climate policy, but Asia will expand its gas use massively. I do think that curve is both accelerating and flattening when it comes to Asia. So already when we look at the IEA data and expectation of in particular Asian gas demand growth, that those curves have flattened, that we expect actually a peak already this decade on the business as usual globally of gas demand. So I think that's really important also to keep that in the picture, that this crisis actually is changing the economics of fossil fuels and of energy at the global level. And I think that's certainly something that's important for countries also like the US, who are both a massive consumer and producer of fossil fuels. So Europe is a key market. Asia was expected to become a key market, but I think it's going to plateau much more quickly than we expected them to, because they've understood the economic and energy security risks of that.
So we talk about supply risk. I'm going to wrap up here and get your comments and any final concerns you have. But when it comes to supply risks, and we look at the future, we look at heat pumps, or we look at grid technologies, or we look at smart meters or other things. Should we be looking at the supply chains there, raw materials, batteries, other things there? But who are the producers? Where are they being made? Are there going to be bottlenecks because of just supply chain regular issues? Is there risk for politicization? And how does China fit into this? So are we opening a new problem set? And if so, are we understanding the risks that we might be bringing on? So please jump in. Lisa.
I mean, this is definitely hugely complex, and I definitely cannot claim to have a good and simple answer. But to your last point, I do not think governments have built the apparatus yet to make those complex decisions and balanced decisions. So just to give you an example, you can obviously opt to try and reshore as much as you can, but this is going to make your transition much more expensive. And hence it comes with other risks. So you will be ending up using fossil fuels for longer, so I don't think in governments in the European Union, we have built the apparatus yet to evaluate and make those complex decisions. But as I said, I expect governments to get there. I know the Germans are writing their security strategy now and their foreign policy strategy, and they will be thinking a lot about exactly those questions. So I do think as much as there will be answers on what to do with specific countries, the most important thing right now will be that governments actually find a way of making those decisions. And the first thing that this implies is have a much better energy security management apparatus. At the moment, energy security decisions are largely outsourced to pipeline owners and grid owners, and they cannot make decisions of that complexity. And recognizing that those decisions start to be decisions that go much beyond the energy question, and you need people with skills in trades, actually also we haven't even touched on climate impacts, right? And how they threaten also supply chains, nuclear power supply, hydropower supply, and so on. So actually finding a way of bringing the right skills into one room and making those quite difficult, complex decisions will be key. And I would suspect that we see a lot of innovation in governments now on how they think about energy security and how they make those decisions. So this may be a different answer to what you expected, but I think that's really key to bring out, because we can speculate for a long time about what China will do with its raw materials, but I think it's about actually building capabilities that we can deal with those complex decisions.
Building in resilience is always a great idea. Oliver, yes, what do you think?
Yes. So maybe to add one or two things on that. The first thing I want to mention is that importing fossil fuels is in some way a bit different from raw materials. That, of course, fossil fuels, we are depending on a continuous supply of them, while with the raw materials we put into PV plants or wind turbines, once we have installed them, they are on our grounds. So that's I think a fundamental difference compared to fossil fuels. And then thinking of clean energy fuels like hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives, that's a market yet to be built. So I think there is really there's a lot more to think of, and I mean the debate is happening on how to build that and how to diversify. And there's much more room also for creating these markets from scratch, basically. And now one more point back to the supply chains. I think that's also nothing theoretical, but it's happening right now. I mean, if you're trying to source a PV panel or a wind turbine, you are currently facing supply chain issues. So I think also the pressure is high on policymakers, but also pressure in the industry to come up with solutions to nearshore, to source materials from other countries. That is there. So I think I would expect more happening in the near future, and not face a sudden supply interruption as we have this right now with Russian natural gas.
And Georg, final word.
Yeah, no, on the question of critical raw materials, I very much share what Lisa and Oliver said. I would potentially American security people would call me naive, but I have also a relatively benign view on that, and I see much more risk on kind of entering a phase of complete protectionism and kind of trying to produce everything domestically. I think that's not going to end well, and I think we are currently in a phase where we are turning our eye towards that. And I mean, you know how IRA is seen in Brussels, and the reaction to that is, yes, we also want to have something like that, and then we all subsidize what we can do domestically, and nobody does what they are good at, but everybody does what the others are doing. I mean, that sounds from an economic standpoint stupid. I mean, David Ricardo is now 300 years or so, and he told us a long time ago that we should focus on the things we are good at. And Europe is not very good at doing energy intensive stuff because we have very little energy. But Europe is good at a lot of smart stuff because we have a lot of good universities still, and well-educated people, and a high capital stock. So that's the things we should be focusing on. And one last thing is I would like to underline what Lisa said and kind of put it on a bit of a broader footing. I think we have outsourced a lot of energy policy making to industry in the past decades in Europe. That has had to do a bit with the idea of we were unable to manage our European integration through government cooperation because it was too difficult. So we said we let the market essentially decide on that, and then we handed over all the energy policy to essentially the market. We have no good data on our energy systems on a European level or even on a national level. We have no understanding anymore of how things function. It's really, I mean, if we look at the Energy Information Administration in the US, we think, wow, that's something we should also have. We need, if we want to do energy policy, we need first of all data and information, and I think that is the first stepping stone. And if you look in how ministries in national governments, but also in Brussels, they are completely understaffed to deal with this crisis. We have a serious issue. And I think that's one thing that I would like to take away from this crisis, that certain really sensitive functions of a state, we need to have the proper staffing also of the oversight bodies to be able to deal with such crisis, because something, I mean, what happened this year has been a catastrophe for Europe, and we were so far barely lucky that we pulled through. But after that already happened with COVID, now with the energy crisis, I think we have a deeper problem than just the issue at hand.
Thank you very much. After a lot of positive ideas, I think that's a little pessimism, but perhaps inspiration for action. So there's a lot that Europe can be doing. There's a question of increasing capacity in terms of understanding cooperation, transatlantic and otherwise. And then there's also this question of the Russian gas sanctions, which I think is very much a short-term question that, thank you, Georg, for bringing it up, and something to think about as we think about next winter and we think about European unity and some of the larger stakes. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you everyone listening. If you have questions to GMF or to the speakers, please let us know. Really looking forward to seeing you again at another Transatlantic Tuesday in 2023. Thank you all.